The bride was sent back for being too smart. The rich rancher rode east to fetch her. The letter came on a Tuesday, which I only remember because my cook, old Hector, burned the beans that morning and we'd been eating hard bread and dried apricots since breakfast, and a man in a foul mood tends to mark things. The letter was from Calhoun Devereaux in Laramie. He was the one who'd arranged the whole business, acted as a kind of clearinghouse, he called himself, between women in the East looking for a start and men in the West looking for a wife. I'd written to him the previous autumn. It had taken me until my 49th year to do it, and I'd sat with the pen in my hand for a good hour before I wrote a word, which should tell you something about how I felt about it. Devereaux wrote in a cramped, sloping hand. He informed me that the woman he'd sent, one Miss Nora Callum, formerly of Philadelphia, had arrived at Hardwick Station and been collected by one Mr. Amos Prout, the man I'd understood to be a different candidate entirely. A mix-up, Devereaux said. He was sorry for the confusion. He also enclosed, almost as an afterthought, a second letter, one he said he was forwarding on Miss Callum's behalf, at her explicit request. I set Devereaux's letter down and picked up hers. It was short. The handwriting was clear and even not ornate. She wrote that she understood there had been a misunderstanding, and that she was presently staying at a boarding house in a town called Millhaven, roughly 4 days east of my ranch, and that if I had any interest in the original arrangement, she would be there for 2 more weeks before she returned to Philadelphia. She did not beg. She did not apologize for the mix-up, which wasn't hers to apologize for. She simply stated the facts and left the door open, and then she closed it by saying she understood completely if I did not come, and that she wished me well regardless. I read that last part again. I understand completely if you do not come. That is a thing most people would write to soften refusal, to give a man an easy out. But the way she wrote it didn't feel like softening. It felt like she meant it. Like she had already considered the outcome where I didn't come and had made her peace with it, and was writing from that place of peace rather than from the place of hoping. That's a hard thing to do. I know because I've tried it myself. I folded both letters and put them in my shirt pocket and walked out to the barn. My horse, a gray named Comb, was eating. I stood in the doorway and listened to the sound of him working through his oats, the wet, rhythmic sound of it, and I looked at the saddle on the rail. It needed restitching on the left fender. I'd been meaning to do it for 3 weeks. I saddled him anyway and rode east. I should tell you who I was at that point, so you understand what I was riding with. My name is Garrett Flood. I owned back then the Flood Flat Ranch, which is about 9,000 acres of grass and alkali pan in the lower part of the territory. My father started it and I built it. Not the land my father left me that, but everything on it. The wells, the fences, the breeding program that turned a scrub herd into something worth selling. 18 years of that. I had 11 men working for me year-round and more in the season, and the closest thing I had to a friend was Hector, who had been my father's cook and who burned the beans once a month without apology. I had money, enough that people in town were careful with me, and careful is not the same as warm. I'd been married once. Her name was Cass, and she died of fever when we were both 31. We'd had 8 years and no children, which was a grief I'd buried under work, and I got good at work the way some men get good at drinking. By the time I was 40, I'd built something considerable, and I had no one to hand it to, and no one who particularly cared that I had it. The men who worked for me respected me. People in Clearwater respected me. Nobody much liked me, and I had long since made my peace with that, or told myself I had. There's a difference between the two. It took me some years to understand that difference, and an honest accounting would put the understanding well past 45. I was not the kind of man who wrote to a clearinghouse for a wife. I want to be clear about that. I told myself the same thing for years, watching other men do it, some of them decent men, some of them sorry ones, and telling myself I was past needing it, or hadn't needed it to begin with. And then one autumn evening I sat down and wrote the letter, and I still cannot tell you exactly why. Something shifted. Maybe it was the quiet in the house when the wind dropped. I don't know. I know I sat at the kitchen table where I'd eaten alone for 18 years, and I thought about the next 18 years, and something in me said no. Just that. No. So that was me. 49 years old, riding east on a gray horse with a saddle that needed fixing, going to meet a woman I'd never seen who'd been sent back from somebody else's arrangement. The sun was already past noon when I left, and the grass on the upper pasture was the color of old straw, and the wind off the flats smelled of alkali and dry clay. And I rode into it and didn't look back at the house because I knew if I did I might turn around. I'd like to say I felt hopeful. Mostly I felt like a fool, but I kept riding. Millhaven was 4 days at a reasonable pace. I made it in 3.5 because I pushed Combe harder than I should have on the 3rd day. The weather was turning uncertain, and I didn't want to get caught in it, and had to walk him the last 6 miles into town, which meant I arrived after dark and smelled like a man who'd ridden hard and slept on the ground, which I had. The town was small. One main street, a general store, a saloon with a cracked window, a church that needed paint, and a boarding house at the far end called Aldridge's. A woman was sweeping the porch when I came up the street. She had a lantern hung on the post beside her, and she was sweeping in the dark, which struck me as either very industrious or very strange. I stopped Combe in front of the saloon and tied him at the rail and got him water from the trough, and then walked down to Aldridge's. The woman with the broom stopped sweeping when I came up the steps. "I'm looking for a Miss Nora Callum," I said. She looked at me for a moment without answering. Not rudely, just taking stock. She was maybe 35, dark-haired, with a face that had seen weather. "She's inside," the woman said. "Reading. It's past 9 o'clock. She reads late, she reads early too. She reads most of the time is the thing." She paused. "You the rancher from the west?" "Garrett Flood. She said you might come." She looked me over once more without much ceremony, "or might not. I'd like to speak with her if she's willing." The woman with the broom, who turned out to be Mrs. Aldridge herself, showed me into a small parlor off the front hall, told me to wait, and went upstairs. I stood and did not sit, because the chair nearest me had a thin cushion and I was stiff from 3 days in the saddle, and I knew if I sat I might not get back up with any dignity. I heard footsteps on the stairs, not quick ones, measured. She came into the parlor carrying a book with her thumb marking the page, which she did not set down. She was about 30, or maybe a shade past it. Brown hair, brown eyes, a dress that was plain and had been ironed carefully. She was not a small woman, and she did not move like one. She moved like someone who was accustomed to taking up the space she occupied, without apology or decoration. She looked at me. Not the way some women look at a man in that situation, trying to judge what he thinks of them, calibrating. She just looked at me, the way you look at a thing you're trying to understand. "Mr. Flood," she said. "Miss Callum. You rode 3 days." 3.5. I said 2 weeks. "I know, I didn't want to wait 2 weeks." She considered that. She still had her thumb in the book. "Sit down, Mr. Flood," she said. "You look like you're about to fall over." I sat. She sat across from me, and she set the book on the table between us, keeping it closed over her thumb so she wouldn't lose her place. I noticed that. It was a small thing, but it was a true thing. She intended to go back to it, no matter how this went. "I'm not what the arrangement described," she said, not unkindly. "The man in Laramie, Devereaux, he left things out." "What things?" "I went to the Drexel Institute," she said. 2 years. I left when my father got sick. I speak French. I have opinions about most subjects I've studied, which is a fair number of subjects. I've been told I argue. I've been told I'm difficult. The man your letter was mistakenly sent to, Mr. Prout. He spent 1 evening with me and rode back to Devereaux's office the next morning and asked that the arrangement be dissolved. He used the word unsuitable. She said this evenly, without embarrassment, but her jaw was set. I wanted to tell you directly so you could make an informed decision. I thought about that. What did you argue about? I said, with Prout. She looked at me steadily. He told me the cattle market was going to stay soft through the following year because the railway extension had opened up too many new routes. I told him that was backwards, that more routes meant more competition for haulage, which would drive freight costs down, and that ranchers who held their stock through the spring would get better prices, not worse. He didn't like that. Was he right or were you right? She lifted an eyebrow. I was right. I read the Rail Commission report. He was guessing. I looked at her for a moment. The lantern on the table between us threw yellow light across her face, and she looked back at me with those steady brown eyes and did not seem particularly anxious about what I was going to say. Most people in her position would have been. She wasn't. My father left me 9,000 acres, I said. I've built it to something considerable. But I've been making decisions about cattle, feed, water, and labor for 18 years mostly by feel. And in the last 3 years, the margins have been narrowing, and I haven't been able to put my finger on exactly why. She was quiet. I don't know anybody who reads Rail Commission reports, I said. Something shifted in her face. Not a smile, not yet, but something moved. Mr. Flood, she said, what exactly is it you're looking for? It was a direct question, and it deserved a direct answer. And I was tired from 3 days in the saddle, and I didn't have the energy for anything else. A partner, I said, not a decoration. I've been alone a long time and I'm not good company and I know it. But I want someone to eat supper with who I don't have to explain things to. I want someone with a mind, and I want someone who'll tell me when I'm wrong, because mostly the people around me don't. Why don't they? Because I pay them. She was quiet for a moment. Then she unclosed her thumb from the book and let the page fall shut, and she set the book on the arm of the chair. I'll need to see the ranch before I agree to anything, she said. That's fair. And I'll have opinions about things. I expect so. And if I say the freight market is going one direction and you think it's going another, then we'll look at the numbers, I said, and whoever's right is right. She looked at me for a long time. The boarding house was quiet around us, the kind of quiet a house gets late at night when everyone else has gone to bed and only 2 people are still awake, talking about something that matters. All right, Mr. Flood, she said, I'll come west and see. We left 2 mornings later. I bought Nora a horse from a man in Millhaven, a sorrel mare with a good temperament and a solid hoof, which Nora inspected herself before she agreed to the purchase, running her hand down each leg in turn and checking the animal's teeth with a practiced ease that told me she'd been around horses before, whatever else she'd been around. Where did you learn that? I said. My uncle kept horses outside the city. I spent summers there. She patted the mare's neck. She'll do. We rode out before the heat came. Nora Callum rode like she moved, like she was comfortable in her own body, not fighting the horse or the saddle or the sun. She wore a hat she'd bought in Millhaven, practical and wide-brimmed, and she asked me, about an hour out, whether the alkali flats I'd mentioned in my original letter were the reason I'd been putting in the 3rd well. I looked at her sideways. Devereaux sent you my letter, I said. He sent me a summary. She kept her eyes on the trail ahead. But you mentioned the well. I assumed it was either drought or alkali, and given what you said about the lower pastures, alkali seemed more likely. It's both, I said. Then you'll need more than a 3rd well. I know. We rode for a while without talking, which I found I didn't mind. Combe and the sorrel walked well together, and the morning was cool enough that you could smell the grass before the heat burned it off. The land out here in the early morning is a different thing than the land at noon. It has a particular quality, a kind of openness, And if you're used to riding it alone, it can feel like company, though that sounds wrong to say aloud. "What's her name?" Nora asked after a while. "Who?" "The mare." I hadn't given her one. I said so. Nora considered this. "Marit," she said. "It's Dutch. My grandmother was Dutch." "What does it mean?" "It doesn't mean anything. It was my grandmother's name." We rode on. I thought about that, giving a horse your grandmother's name. It was a quiet kind of loyalty, naming something alive after someone you'd lost. I didn't say anything about it, but I thought about it for the rest of that day. We camped the first night in a hollow with a creek that still had water in it, though not much. I made a fire and Nora unpacked the food she'd brought from the boarding house: good bread, wrapped hard cheese, dried beef that was better than what I'd been eating on the way out. She'd thought about the provisions. I hadn't asked her to, and she hadn't mentioned it. She'd just done it. We ate on opposite sides of the fire, and then she asked me about my first wife. I went still for a moment. People in Clearwater didn't ask me about Cass. They'd learned not to over the years, and I'd let them learn that, which I suppose was its own kind of choice. "Her name was Cass," I said. "She died 18 years ago." Nora waited. When I didn't go on, she said, "I'm sorry." "We had good years," I said. "Not enough of them." "Were you happy?" Nobody had ever asked me that directly. I thought about it. "Yes," I said, "we were. It wasn't easy. The ranch was small then and we worked hard. But yes." "You stopped being happy when she died." It wasn't really a question. I looked across the fire at her. "I stopped thinking about it," I said. "Being happy. There was too much to do." "That's one way," she said. "Not a judgment, just an observation." "What's the other way?" I said. "Be miserable for a while," she said, "and then decide not to be any more." "You sound like you speak from experience." "I do." She was quiet for a moment, looking at the fire. The firelight moved on her face, and she didn't seem to be performing the memory, just visiting it. "My father was sick for 3 years. I left school to care for him. He died 4 years ago. I spent 2 years after that being very quietly miserable, and then I decided to do something else." "Right to clearinghouse," I said. "Among other things," she said, and there was a dry edge to her voice that I liked. "What other things?" "I wrote a paper on the economics of Western land grants," she said. "I sent it to 3 journals. One of them published it." I looked at her. "Under E.N. Callum," she said, a little flatly. "Eileen or Nora. I used the initials because they wouldn't have taken it seriously otherwise." I thought about a woman writing a paper about Western land economics and publishing it under false initials because the world wouldn't listen to her real name. I thought about Mr. Prout, who had spent one evening with her and called her unsuitable. I thought about what the word unsuitable covers when it's used that way, how much it covers, and how little it says about the person it's aimed at. "The paper," I said. "What was the argument?" She looked at me across the fire. The light caught the planes of her face, and she was serious, deciding whether I actually wanted to know or was just being polite. "That the current land grant system was systematically undervaluing grazing land in the lower territories, because the federal assessors were using rainfall data from the previous decade, which was anomalously wet," she said. "If the assessors were using accurate averages, a significant portion of the grants would be classed differently, which would affect what ranchers could borrow against them and what they could sell them for." I was quiet for a moment. "That's what's been hurting the margins," I said. "Not just the margins, the whole valuation." "If you've borrowed against federal assessment," she said, "yes, very possibly." We sat with that for a while. The fire crackled and popped, and the creek moved in the dark, and somewhere far off a coyote said its piece to the night sky. "You're going to read my books when we get back," I said. "I was going to ask permission first." "You have it," I said, "all of them." She looked at me for a moment, and this time she did smile, small and real, not decorative. "Thank you, Mr. Flood," she said. "Garrett," I said. She was quiet for a beat. "Garrett," she said. It came out even and plain the way she said most things, but it was the first time and I noticed it. On the second day of riding, a storm came down from the northwest in the afternoon, not severe, but enough that we had to find shelter earlier than I'd planned. There was an old line camp about 3 miles off the main trail that I knew, built against a limestone outcropping with a roof that mostly held. We rode for it and made it before the worst of the rain came in. The camp was small and smelled of old ash and mice, and there was wood stacked by the door that someone had left, dry enough to burn. I got the stove going while Nora got the horses in out of the weather and under the lean-to on the east side. I heard her talking to them while she worked, low and even, not baby talk, just matter-of-fact reassurance. Combe settled under it better than I'd expected. He was particular about strangers. She came in out of the rain with her coat dark at the shoulders and her hat dripping, and she looked at the stove with something like relief. "Tea," she said. "Do you have tea?" I did. I'd picked some up at the trading post in Millhaven when I'd bought my provisions, as an afterthought, not sure why. I told her so. She looked at me for a moment with something that wasn't quite surprise, and then she didn't say anything, but she took the tin and made the tea herself, finding a pot that was passable and water from a barrel outside the lean-to, and we sat in the small, dry warmth of the line camp while the rain came off the outcropping, and the stove ticked, and the horses moved quietly in the lean-to. "Tell me about the ranch," she said. "Not the figures, the ranch." I thought about that. People didn't ask me that. People asked about acreage and water rights and head count. The ranch as a thing, as a place, was something I lived in, not something I described. "In the early morning," I said, "before the hands are up, it's the quietest place I've ever been. The grass moves. The windmill turns. You can hear the cattle a mile off and they're just a low sound like the land breathing." I stopped. "That sounds foolish." "It doesn't," she said. "There's a ridge on the south end where you can see the whole lower pasture at once. I go up there sometimes when I'm working something out. It doesn't help with the problem exactly, but it settles the thinking." She held her cup in both hands and watched the stove. "I used to walk to the river when I was working something out," she said. "In Philadelphia, the Schuylkill, not the nice part, the part the boats used. There was a smell off it in summer that nobody would call pleasant. But the water moving helped." "Moving water," I said. "Moving anything," she said. "Something that doesn't stop." The rain eased after an hour and then stopped, and we rode the last 2 hours before dark in the washed air, which was cool and clean and smelled of wet sage and cut grass, and the sky in the west went 3 colors before the dark came down. We rode 3 more days after that. I learned things in pieces, the way you learn them from someone who's not performing, just being. She woke early, without complaint, and was already watering Merritt by the time I had the fire going. She had a habit of tucking a loose strand of hair behind her left ear when she was thinking hard about something. She didn't fill silences unless she had something to put in them, which made the silences comfortable rather than tense. She had a laugh that she kept mostly to herself, just a quiet exhale through the nose, but it was real when it came. On the 3rd day we passed through a small settlement, a trading post, a handful of homesteads, and the man at the trading post, a heavy-set fellow who recognized me from the spring drive, looked at Nora with a look I recognized. Not unkind, exactly. Just the look a man gives a woman who's riding out in the territory with a single man, putting together what the story might be. "Headed home, Flood," he said. "That's right," I said. He looked at Nora again. She looked back at him, pleasant and level, and said nothing. We bought flour and coffee and a tin of molasses and rode on, and after we were out of earshot, Nora said, "He was trying to work out who I was." "He was. What will people in your town make of the situation?" I thought about that. Clearwater was a small town and it had opinions about most things. Some of them will find it interesting, I said. A few will disapprove of how we traveled. Most will keep their thoughts to themselves because I've been in the county longer than most of them. And if I'm not what they expect, she said, it wasn't a worried question, it was a practical one. Then you're not, I said. Clearwater doesn't run my ranch. She was quiet for a moment, then she said, the arrangement. When we arrive, what exactly is the next step? There's a minister in Clearwater, I said. If you've seen the ranch and you're willing, we'd go to him. And if I'm not willing? Then I'd get you back to the railway and you'd go home. You wouldn't be angry. No, I said, and I meant it. I'd given up expecting things to go a certain way a long time ago. I'd be disappointed, but no. She rode for a while, looking ahead at the grass and the long pale sky. You mean that, she said. It wasn't a question. I don't say things I don't mean, I said. It takes too much effort to keep track. That got the small, quiet laugh from her, the real one, and I felt something loosen in my chest that I hadn't known was tight. We came in sight of the ranch on the 4th afternoon. I watched her face when she saw it. The main house first, 2 stories, stone foundation, the porch I'd built the second summer after Cass died when I needed something to do with my hands. Then the outbuildings, the barn, the bunkhouse, the long fence lines running south and east, the windmill turning slowly in the afternoon heat, the water trough catching the light. She didn't say anything for a moment. It's bigger than I pictured, she said. The lower pasture isn't visible from here, I said. It runs another 1.5 miles south. She looked at it steadily, the way she looked at most things, taking it in from the inside rather than the outside. The windmill, she said, is that for the second well? The second well. The third one's by hand pump still. She nodded, still looking. You'll want to run a pipe from the windmill to the near trough. The far trough can stay on the hand pump for now, but the cattle will wear a rut between them if they have to choose. I looked at her. I know, I said. I've been meaning to do it. What stopped you? Cost, and I wasn't sure the windmill was reliable enough in dry months. What's the failure rate? 3 times in the last 2 years. That's not bad, she said. You run the pipe, you'll get it down to 2. The cattle traffic near the hand pump is the bigger problem. That's where your fence losses are coming from on the south end. I turned and looked at her fully. I haven't told you about the fence losses on the south end, I said. No, she said, but cattle make ruts to water and ruts become paths, and when the path goes through a fence line, the fence loses. She glanced at me. Did I get that wrong? No, I said. You got that exactly right. We rode down toward the house. Hector came out of the kitchen door when he heard us coming and stood on the step with his arms crossed, looking at us. He looked at Nora for a long time. This is Miss Callum, I said, dismounting. Hector looked at her. You speak any Spanish, he said. A little, she said, more French. French isn't useful out here, Hector said. I know, she said. I've been working on the Spanish. Hector looked at her for another moment, then back at me, and I could see him deciding something. He uncrossed his arms. I'll put supper on, he said, and went back inside. That was the closest thing to approval Hector gave anyone. I showed her the ranch that evening and the following morning. All of it, the books, the breeding records, the grazing rotation charts I'd drawn and redrawn over 15 years, the water survey from the territorial office. She went through the books at the kitchen table after supper that night with a lamp pulled close, and I sat across from her with a cup of coffee I didn't particularly need, watching the way she turned pages. Purposeful, economical. Not looking for a general sense of things, looking for something specific. Around midnight she sat back and said, Your grazing rotation in the east section is wrong. In what way? You're rotating on a 6-week cycle. In a dry year that's fine, but in a normal year with normal rainfall, The grass in the east section recovers faster than 6 weeks, which means you're losing 4 to 6 days of optimal grazing twice per season. That's not a large number. Over 9,000 acres, compounded over 15 years. It's a significant number, I said. Yes, she said. I drank my coffee. I've been doing it wrong for 15 years, I said. She looked at me directly. You've been doing it in a way that was safe and reliable and worked well enough that you built something considerable, she said. Now you have someone who reads a lot and has time to look at the numbers. That's different from doing it wrong. I thought about that. You're being generous, I said. I'm being precise, she said. There's a difference. She went back to the books. I watched her for another minute, then refilled my coffee and didn't go to bed. In the morning, I showed her the east fence line. We rode the full southern boundary, and I showed her where the ruts ran, and she got off Merritt and crouched down and looked at the ground the way you look at something you want to understand from the ground level. And then she stood and said, "You need 40 yards of new cedar post from the ridge to that second juncture. Everything else is maintenance, not replacement." The man who looked at it last spring said 60 yards. He was wrong, she said pleasantly. Do you want to measure it? I looked at the fence line and I looked at her and I said, I don't need to measure it. She didn't say anything to that, but she looked at me for a moment with something in her eyes that I hadn't seen directed at me in a long time. Not admiration exactly, just recognition. Like she was seeing what I was and found it acceptable. Like the word unsuitable had never applied to either of us, and she saw that now, and she wanted me to know she did. We rode back toward the house in the early afternoon, and the sun came down flat and white, and the grass on the upper pasture was still green at the roots, not gone yet, not for another month. I could hear the windmill turning, the old rhythmic click of it, and somewhere off to the east one of the hands was working the hand pump, and you could hear the squeak of it all the way up to the ridge. Garrett, she said. I looked over at her. She was riding with one hand easy on the reins and her eyes on the pasture, and she said, I've thought about what you said, in the parlor, in Millhaven. All right. About wanting a partner, she paused. I want you to know that what you said, the way you said it, it wasn't what I expected. What did you expect? Someone who wanted a housekeeper and someone to produce children and would have dressed it up as more than that. She was still looking at the pasture. The man in Philadelphia I almost married, he was kind enough and he wanted the right things, he just wanted them for himself. The house to be run well, children to carry on the name, a woman to be present. In the house, she paused. He was not interested in what I read. Prout called you unsuitable, I said. Yes. Prout's an idiot, I said. That got more than the small laugh. She turned and looked at me and smiled, and it was the first full smile I'd seen from her, real and uncalculated, and it changed her face the way sunlight changes a field. That's the most direct thing you've said to me, she said. I've been working up to it, I said. She laughed again, quieter, and looked back at the pasture. I'll stay, she said, evenly, no performance in it. If you still want the arrangement, I'll stay. I held that for a moment. The windmill turned. The sorrel mare walked steady under her. The grass moved in a slow wave along the ridge. I want the arrangement, I said. Then we'll go see the minister, she said. And after that, I'd like to write to the Territorial Water Office and ask for their updated survey. I'll send the letter, I said. We'll send it together, she said, and she said it the same way she said most things, matter of fact and clear, but it landed different. We'll send it together, like a thing that was already true. We were married on a Friday morning, 3 days after we came back. The minister was a small, spare man named Colby who performed most of the weddings in the county for 20 years and who shook my hand afterward and looked at Nora and said, You're a lucky man, Flood. I said, I know it. Nora was standing a step away talking to Colby's wife, and she glanced back at me when she heard that, just briefly, and something in her face told me she'd heard it and that it mattered to her that I'd said it plainly, without hesitation. Not performed. Not the right thing to say in front of a minister. Just the truth. The men from the ranch came to the small supper Hector put together that evening. They were polite and a little cautious, the way men are around a new thing they haven't figured out yet. Nora talked to my foreman, Bale, for a solid 20 minutes about the grazing rotation, and by the end of it Bale was nodding and had the look of a man who has realized something he should have known. He glanced over at me once while they were talking, and I gave him nothing back, and he went back to listening to Nora. Later, when they'd gone and Hector had cleared the kitchen and the house was quiet, Nora and I sat on the porch in the dark. The sky was enormous and clear and very far away, the way it gets out here at night when there's no moon, just that white wash of stars from one end of the sky to the other. "What are you thinking?" she said. "The east fence," I said. "I'm thinking I should have looked at it from the ground 2 years ago." She was quiet for a moment, and then she said, "I'm not." "What are you thinking?" "That I'm glad you rode east," she said. "That I'm glad you didn't wait 2 weeks." I looked at her in the dark. She was looking at the stars. "I thought you meant it," I said. "When you said you understood if I didn't come, I thought you were already halfway home in your head." "I was," she said, "mostly, but I didn't close the door all the way." "Why not?" She was quiet a moment. "Because you wrote the letter," she said. "Not what Devereaux summarized, the actual letter he sent me. And you wrote it like a man who was honest about what he had and what he lacked and what he wanted, and I don't meet many people who are honest about all 3 of those things at once." She paused. "Most people are honest about what they have, or what they want, not usually the middle part." I thought about the hour I'd spent with the pen in my hand before I wrote a word. What I'd been trying to do was say the true thing without making it sound like I was asking for pity or selling something. I hadn't known if I'd managed it. "I meant it," I said, "the letter." "I know you did," she said. "That's why I didn't close the door." We sat in the dark for a while longer. There was no wind, which is rare out here. Usually the grass is moving, the windmill turning, something always going. But that night it was still, and the stars just sat up there doing their work. And Nora Callum, Nora Flood now, though it would take me some time to get used to that, was beside me on the porch of a house that had been quiet for too long. She put her hand on my arm. Not a dramatic gesture. Just placed it there, like she was telling me something that didn't need words, and I put my hand over hers and we sat that way while the stars moved their slow, imperceptible wheel overhead, and the ranch around us was still and dark and mine ours, and I felt, for the first time in a long time, like a man who'd done something right. I won't pretend the months after were perfect. They weren't, and perfection was never what either of us was after. She was right about the east section grazing rotation. We changed it, and by the following spring the grass was noticeably better, and Bale, who had been cautious about her at first, brought it up himself one morning over the fence rail and said, "Your wife's grazing idea worked out." "Her idea?" I said. "Yes." He nodded without any further comment, which from Bale was considerable. She wrote to the Territorial Water Office and they sent the updated survey, and it confirmed what she'd suspected about the alkali expansion in the lower pasture. We adjusted the herd numbers in that section, which hurt in the short term and helped in the second year. I wouldn't have done it without her telling me to, not because I didn't see the problem, but because I'd been managing it the same way for so long that changing felt like admitting something. "You're not admitting failure," she said, the evening I finally agreed to move the cattle. "You're incorporating new information." "It feels the same from the inside," I said. "It does," she said. "Do it anyway." In the first weeks there were adjustments, small ones, the kind that come with any 2 people learning to share a space that one of them has had to himself for a long time. I was used to a particular quiet in the mornings and a particular disorder in the kitchen, and Hector had strong opinions about where things belonged and about who was allowed to have opinions about where things belonged, which did not traditionally include me. Nora navigated Hector with a patience that I came to understand was deliberate rather than natural. She wasn't naturally patient. I figured that out quick enough. And within 2 weeks he was showing her where the good pans were and explaining, at some length, the proper ratio of fat to corn for the skillet bread he made on Sundays. I watched this from a distance and did not comment, because commenting on things you're grateful for has a way of making them self-conscious. The men took longer. Men on a working ranch generally know where their authority is and where it isn't, and a woman who could stand at a fence line and tell them how many yards of post they needed was a new category of thing. Bale was first to come around, which mattered because where Bale went the rest generally followed. He had a question about the water rotation schedule one morning in the 3rd week, and he came to find me and I was in the north pasture, and instead he found Nora in the study with the maps, and she answered his question, and it was the right answer, and he went away and did what she'd said. That evening he told 2 of the other hands, in my hearing but without looking at me, that Mrs. Flood knew the South Survey better than any man he'd worked with. He said it plain, no ceremony to it, and went back to eating. I looked at my plate and did not say anything and felt, in my chest, a particular kind of warmth that I suspect my face didn't show at all. She kept her books in the study off the front hall. I had never used that room for much. It had been my father's office, and after he died I'd moved my own papers to the kitchen table, which made more practical sense, and which Hector had been complaining about for 15 years. Nora set up the study in the 1st week, organized the books by subject along the back wall, and hung a map of the territory, a good detailed one, on the left-hand wall with pins marking the well locations and the fence lines and the grazing sections. She updated the pins as things changed. I went into the study sometimes in the evenings and stood in front of the map, and it told me more about my own land than I'd been able to see clearly in 18 years. One evening in December she found me there, standing in front of the map with a lamp, looking at the water distribution across the south end. "What are you working out?" she said. "The 4th well," I said. "I think we need it by spring, not summer." She came and stood beside me. She smelled of cold air and lamplight and the particular soap she used, and she looked at the map with me, and after a moment she put her finger on a point about 3 miles southeast of the 3rd well location. "There," she said, "not there." She moved her finger a half-inch south of where I'd been looking. "The water table follows the old creek bed. You can see it on the survey. The contour line curves south about 60 yards before it comes back. You want the well on the curve, not above it." I looked at where she was pointing. "The survey doesn't show that clearly," I said. "No, but the old-growth grass does." She tapped the map. "This section, see the color difference in the summer surveyor's rendering. That grass is deeper rooted. It's finding water that the cattle grass isn't. The water's there." I looked at the map for a moment, then I looked at her. "How did you see that?" I said. "I've been reading the surveys for 3 months," she said simply. "You've been here 3 months," I said. "Yes," she said. "I've been reading them every day." I looked back at the map, and at the point she'd indicated, and I knew she was right the same way I always knew when something was right. The certainty that settled in the gut before the mind had finished working it out. "I'll send Bale to look at the ground in the morning," I said. "He'll see it," she said. "The grass tells you if you know to look." I turned to her. We were close in the small study, the lamp between us casting its yellow light, and she was looking at the map still, her expression easy and certain, and I thought about de Verwe's letter, and about Prout, and about the letter she'd written that I'd read twice before I got up and saddled Combe. "I understand completely if you do not come." "Nora," I said. She looked at me. I didn't have a prepared speech. I'm not a man who prepares speeches, but I wanted to say something that was true, so I said the truest thing I had. I don't know what I was doing before you came, I said. I thought I did. I thought I was building something. You were, she said. You built something considerable. I was building half of something, I said. The other half was missing and I'd been pretending I didn't notice. She looked at me steadily. Then she stepped toward me and put both hands on my chest and looked up at me with those calm brown eyes that always saw exactly what was there, not more and not less. You noticed enough to write the letter, she said. That's the only smart thing I did, I said. It was enough, she said. She was close and the lamplight was warm between us and I put my arms around her and she let me. And for a moment, we just stood in my father's old study in front of the map of a ranch that was becoming something neither of us could have built alone. She turned her face slightly and rested it against my collarbone, and I felt the solidity of her, the realness of her, the particular weight and warmth of a person who had decided to stay. Not decided to make the best of it, decided to stay. There's a difference, and I felt it. Outside the window, the first hard cold had come down from the north, and the windmill had stopped turning for the first time since October, and the ranch was quiet under a sky that was beginning, at the edges, to show the particular orange-white of the first serious snow. We stood there a while. Bale found the water exactly where she said it was. The well went in February, 3 months before I'd planned. By summer it was the most reliable of the four, which Bale mentioned once without any particular expression on his face, and which I mentioned to Nora that evening, and which she received without saying anything, though the corner of her mouth moved. People in Clearwater took their time forming opinions as people in small towns do. By the spring most of them had formed one. It wasn't complicated. The Flood Ranch was doing well and getting better, and Garrett Flood's wife was something, and if you wanted a thing explained clearly you could ask her and she'd explain it. Some people found that notable. A few people found it irritating. Most people over time found it useful. The minister Colby's wife told Nora at the summer social that she was a good influence on me, and Nora thanked her, and afterward on the ride home I asked what she'd said back. I said you didn't need much influencing, she said, just someone to look at the numbers with. That's generous. It's precise, she said, and I felt that warmth again, the one that had been missing for a long time before she came settle into the space between my ribs where the quiet had lived. It's been 6 years now. The ranch is 12,000 acres. We bought the adjacent parcel in the 3rd year, which was Nora's idea. She'd seen the owner's tax situation before I had worked out the numbers, and came to supper one evening with the calculation already done and a piece of paper to show me. I sent the offer the following week. The 4th well is still the most reliable. The east pasture produces at a rate that Bale calls, without self-consciousness, the best in the county. The books are in the study on the back wall, organized by subject, with 3 new shelves that I built myself the 2nd winter. Nora's article was published under her real name last spring, in a journal that covers Western land management, and I read it twice, and the 2nd time I read it I sat for a while after and thought about the Drexel Institute, and the 2 years she'd given up, and the initials she'd used, and felt something I didn't have a word for exactly. Something between pride and anger on her behalf that had nowhere to go except to keep building the thing we were building. She found me at the kitchen table with the journal and she said, "You've read it twice." 3 times, I said, which was by then true. She sat down across from me. The morning light came in through the east window and lay across the table between us, and she looked at me in the way she'd always looked at me, directly, without trying to soften or inflate what she saw. "It's a good article," I said. "It was right 6 years ago and it's still right." "The data is more complete now," she said. "A lot more land has turned over, the pattern holds." "You should send it to the territorial office," I said. "I already did," she said, and the corner of her mouth lifted. I looked at her across the table in the morning light. 49 when I saddled Combe and rode east, 55 now. I'd gotten older, which was happening whether I noticed it or not, and I had the kind of face that shows it, more weathered every year, more lines, more gray in what hair I had left. The ranch had grown, and the work had gotten harder in some ways and easier in others, and I was not the same man who'd stood in the barn that Tuesday morning looking at a saddle that needed fixing. I was better, not softer, better. I felt, sitting there with Nora across from me, and the morning light on the table, and the windmill turning outside, and the ranch doing what ranches do, something I hadn't expected to feel again, something I'd told myself I was past needing. Valued seen. A man with something to offer and someone who wanted what he had, not what he owned, not the acreage or the breeding records or what he could provide, but what he actually was. The man who rode out in the dark to look at fences nobody else thought to check. The man who meant what he put in letters. The man who sat with the pen for an hour because he wanted to get it right and not because he was trying to seem like something he wasn't. The man who, when someone said we'll send it together, understood what that meant and felt it land where it was supposed to, not in the head, but lower than that, in the part of a man that remembers what it is to be known. She reached across the table and put her hand flat on the journal, on the page with her name on it, her real name, the full one, both words, and she looked at me and said, "None of this would have been written the same way without the Flood Ranch data. You know that." "I know," I said. "I mean it," she said. "The sample size, the acreage, the water records going back 18 years, it's the most complete set in the territory. No other rancher in the lower counties kept records the way you did. I've been building on your work for 6 years. The article exists because you kept those books." I thought about the books. The ledgers going back to my father's time, and then mine after that, the water survey I'd filed and refiled and kept in the cedar chest, because it seemed like the sort of thing a man ought to keep even when he wasn't sure why. I'd done it because it was right practice. I hadn't known it would matter to anyone but me. I put my hand on hers. The morning was quiet and the sun was coming through the window, and I thought about the Tuesday with the burned beans and the letter in my shirt pocket, and the hour with the pen in my hand before I wrote the first word. "We've been building on each other's work," I said. She looked at me for a moment, and then she turned her hand over under mine and held on. Outside, the windmill turned. The grass in the east pasture moved in a slow, long wave. The sky was the particular blue it gets out here in early summer, before the heat has fully come, when everything is still possible, and the morning is still cool, and the land around you feels like something you earned rather than something you were handed. That's what I remember when I think about it. Not the hardest days, not the losses. That morning, and her hand in mine, and the article with her name on it, and the grass moving out the window, and the feeling of a man who rode east on a gray horse and came back with more than he'd gone looking for. I went looking for someone to have supper with. I found the other half of what I was building. That's about as good as I know how to say it.